Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Season 3 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
So, Graham, last Tuesday we undertook our first The Dark Money Files live event in central London with LexisNexis Risk Solutions. It was a great evening, wasn't it?
I thought it was brilliant, Ray.
Yeah.
I had a fantastic time.
And we met so many interesting people, didn't we?
We did, and names that we knew from online, but had never actually met in person. So that was fantastic.
Yeah, it was great. And we were able to use visual resources for the first time to present a more complex case than we'd normally attempt on the podcast. And I think we'll have to consider how we might share a version just in audio or in some other way for the regular podcast, because it's a fascinating case.
It is, and I know later on in the podcast today we're going to have a chat about some ideas that we've got just to develop kind of what we've started with the podcast. So yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I was going to say, Ray, I think one of the other things that happened on Tuesday was quite a few people were interested in past episodes of the podcast and what has happened since. So, where these stories have developed. So it seemed like a good idea to have a retrospective to bring some of those stories up to date.
And we'd already started looking at that with a view to bringing people up to speed. So now seems to be an ideal time to do it.
It really does. But before we do...
Oh, yes, you've got some stats to share, haven't you?
I've got some statistics. It just seems if we a retrospective, it's a good chance to look at how many people have heard this. So you may remember, Ray, that our very first episode was put onto the internet on the 6th of January this year, 2019. And according to Buzzsprout, who host our podcast, that first episode has been listened to well over 4,000 times.
Actually, Graham, I think it's probably more because I'm not convinced we're getting true numbers out of iTunes. Most podcasters say that they don't get proper numbers from them.
And I think you're absolutely right. We can. It does allegedly have iTunes in the statistics, but also looking at the iTunes specific statistics, the two don't really compare. So I think you're spot on.
But either way, that's for a fairly niche subject, that's a lot of listens.
It flipping is, Ray, and not just a lot of listens. It's geographically incredibly diverse. According again to Buzzsprout, that podcast has been listened to in 1,256 different towns and cities across the world in 112 different countries.
So not just our families then.
No, even our somewhat extended families, no.
And I expect that one or two of those countries may have had people listening for, in one way or another, professional reasons to what we were talking about.
I think you're right, and probably more the other way than the one, frankly. but yeah, yes. And it's probably no coincidence that in addition to some of the more likely listening locations like the UK and the US, which you would expect, some of the other very high scorers are the Scandinavian countries along with the Baltics.
Okay, fair enough. And what about ages? Because you've got some stats on that as well, haven't you, Graham?
I have, and these are from Spotify, who have just really started taking podcasting seriously and are really putting some effort into providing feedback for podcasters. And they tell us that significantly the largest age range of our listeners is the 28 to 34 bracket, which is 36% of our audience, and that's followed by 23 to 27-year-olds with 26%. So what's that? Over 60% are between 23 and 34.
I'm trying to avoid the phrase "down with the kids," but I think it's important that I do avoid it.
Well, I was just thinking that was more or less our own age range anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, well, right. Yeah, only on radio. And are there any other interesting statistics you've got out of this analysis?
Well, Ray, I think we're going to have to be careful with the word interesting here, because what I think is interesting may not be what other people do. But because it's Spotify, it also tells us what are the artists who are most listened to by our audience. And if you're interested in
Mm,
order from top down, Ed Sheeran comes top,
mm.
followed by Taylor Swift, and then Post Malone, Lana Del Rey, and the Beatles.
Well, that's something of an eclectic mix.
But I'm going to be honest here. I've never heard of Post Malone.
You mean the American rapper and singer-songwriter who went from genre novelty to certified superstar, amassing a string of top 10 singles with a hybrid style that joined his unique vocal delivery, pained lyrics, and hip-hop production, Graham?
Um, um, I thought he was the bloke that did the choir competitions.
No, well, popular culture clearly isn't your strong point, Graham. I've done my revision, mate.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't. I have heard of the Beatles, though, Ray.
Yes, I think we'd better move on, don't you?
I think we'd better. So, if you recall, we then launched our main sequence of podcasts with a very in-depth look at what happened at Danske Bank.
Yeah, I remember that going on for a number of episodes, and the
Hmm.
story keeps rumbling on too beyond those episodes, doesn't it?
Well, it does. So, Ray, what's been happening there
Hmm.
lately?
Well, there's been quite a few new appointments at the top of the house. They snaffled a new CFO from Commerzbank, and the former regional head of HSBC's Financial Crime Compliance Division in Europe went to head up their Surveillance and Investigations Division.
Did he? That could
Hmm.
keep him busy.
Well, I think so.
And what's happened to some of their former senior managers, Ray?
Well, several of them have allegedly been charged by the Danish police, including former CEO Thomas Borgen. And just to add to their woes, a recent report on Bloomberg suggests that the bank has also been referred to the police for overcharging retail investors.
Um, to the police.
Well, yeah, apparently regulation works somewhat differently in Denmark compared with, say, the UK, and there's separation between the regulator, which regulates in a conventional sense, and enforcement action, which the police are responsible for.
Wow, it sounds so much worse, doesn't it, when you're being investigated by the police?
Yes, it does.
And that wasn't a reference to 1970s popular beat combos either. So, meanwhile, a host of criminal investigations into what happened at Danske Bank rumble on all around the world.
They do, and not just around Danske Bank. We've seen an announcement from Swedbank that acknowledges ongoing issues with their anti-money laundering as well.
Yes, that's a story that we initially covered in a special episode as part of season one, which followed the publication of the initial, and I think we thought somewhat sparse, Swedbank report.
Absolutely. I mean, to be fair to Swedbank, they haven't actually tried to spin their situation.
Good, because that cost its previous CEO, Birgitte Bonnesen, her job.
Well, quite. Following her departure earlier this year, Swedbank appointed a new CEO, Jens Henriksson, who officially takes over on October the 1st. They've also appointed the law firm Clifford Chance to conduct the full historical review into potential money laundering through the bank, a report that is expected in early 2020.
Can't wait. And as I understand it, the bank's next quarterly report, which is due on the 23rd of October this year, will contain an update on progress so far.
Which, no doubt, assuming it passes the of any interest bar, will
Mhm.
report on when it arrives.
Definitely.
Mm. So, also in the Nordics, six of the major banks in that region have joined forces to create a combined KYC utility due to launch in 2020.
Which is almost certainly a good thing, but it does bring some rather interesting challenges, doesn't it?
Oh, well, yes, it does. Shall we linger on them for a while?
Well, shall we? Let's start then, Ray, with the benefits.
Okay, well, first, it definitely improves the customer experience. So, if a firm banks with more than one of those six institutions, which is quite likely given the plethora of products which are required today, it should mean that they only need to provide one set of KYC documents, which all of the banks can then share an access to meet their internal requirements.
Yeah, but it does also mean that to a pretty large degree, the banks need to have identical KYC requirements as well, so that that documentation is acceptable to all of them.
Yes, but they already have to meet the legal and regulatory requirements anyway, Graham, which are the same for all of them.
Well, that's true, but what about their own individual risk appetites?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I mean, the banks might have different product portfolios, different customer segments, and
Hmm.
might carve things up differently, and consequently have their control set in a different place, so that due diligence means something slightly different for each of them. Well, I don't think you can do that if you're relying solely on a KYC utility, because you've got to assess each customer at the same common understanding of risk levels. Now, that means a standardized risk scoring across the banks, which
Hmm.
then doesn't allow for one bank to have a higher or lower tolerance to residual risk, even sort of in specialist product areas.
No, I completely agree. And I know that you have a really good analogy to explain this. So, do you want to share that with our audience?
Yeah, go on then. So this is the one about the mountain climbing, isn't it?
It is.
So if you try and climb the north face of the Eiger or the Matterhorn, Graham, as I'm sure you'll want to do,
I think
um,
about it all the time, Ray. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, if you were to do that with no safety equipment at all, in a practice which I believe is called free soloing, you risk almost certain death if you fall off.
Yeah, but there genuinely is no chance of me ever doing that, right?
Well, absolutely. So then there's free climbing, which uses climbing aids solely as a safety mechanism and not as an aid to the climb itself.
Oh, okay. So the safety equipment effectively only cuts in if, or in my case, when you fall off.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's aid climbing, where the equipment specifically contributes to your ability to climb the mountain. And that could be anything from hammering wedges or hooks into the rock to being fully roped up and in full harness.
Okay, so and that's analogous, isn't it, to a risk
Hmm.
appetite? It
Yep.
depends on the bank's view of the inherent risk residing with its customers and the level of risk it wants to take. That will determine the type and intensity of the controls it puts into place.
Absolutely, thus ending up with a residual risk that's within its appetite.
Yes.
But the utility approach is more akin to having a blanket requirement, forcing anyone who wishes to climb a specific mountain to adopt a mandatory set of harnesses, ropes, crampons, and so on before they even start the climb.
Okay, I think that's a really good analogy, and it's not for us, of course, to say which is the right approach, but I think it is inherent on us and what we do to point out that there are significant differences.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on. We've also had some very high-profile stories around, for example, the Troika laundromat, which was also
Uh-huh.
called Yukio Leaks, which is the now defunct Lithuanian bank, which found itself at the heart of the story and which we covered in a special again earlier on this year.
Absolutely. And then there's another more recent story that 25 countries around the world have set up a working group to analyse the transactions coming out of ABLV Bank in Latvia. Apparently, that review will also look at the participation of the bank's employees and other related parties in order to assess whether any criminal activity took place on their part.
And Ray, wouldn't we be shocked if the outcome was positive?
Not really, Graham. No. I mean, it's long been our thesis that any bank that finds itself at the heart of significant money laundering activity will have been infiltrated, one way or the other, by people working on behalf of the criminals. Because it's so unlikely that any professional money launderer would send millions, or these days billions, of dollars of transactions through a bank without being well aware of their controls and, even better, having operatives on the inside ensuring these transactions don't get reported.
Yes. So this is quite an unprecedented approach by the Latvian regulator, gathering together representatives of I was going to say all, but at least most of the countries involved in sending and receiving that money to ABLV in order to analyse the scale of the activities.
Indeed, and I gather they think it will take a couple of years to sort it all out.
Yeah, and doesn't that just emphasize the scale of what was happening? And
Mm.
that was just one bank amongst many.
It seems overwhelming at times. You could get quite depressed, couldn't you?
Well, you could, but I genuinely think that we're starting to turn a corner. And I know I'm the perennial optimist, but the publicity these stories have received have brought about, I think, a real change in public perception of financial crime. And that's got to be a good thing.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'll cautiously agree with you, Graham. And even if it's only in a tiny way, our participation through the Dark Money Files podcasts and events can be hopefully part of that change.
Well, yeah, in lots of towns and cities across the world, which is nice. So,
Yeah.
and of course, now we have, as we mentioned at the start, the live event, which is
Hmm.
also, I hope, helping to contribute to that change in viewpoint.
Yes, quite. And we've got another announcement along those lines too. Yes.
We do, and Ray, as this is definitely going to be your baby, I think you should do it.
Okay, then. Well, as some of you know, I'm about to finish in my current role as an interim MLRO and head of compliance. It's been pretty full on over the past year, but after a brief rest, I've got a number of Dark Money Files projects to turn my attention to. Um, one of those is to set up the Dark Money Files YouTube channel to augment much of what we do on the podcast and to act as a bridge between the podcast and the live events. So I see us adding, an additional dimension to what we're doing through the podcast, although the podcast will continue in its current form.
Which just sounds really exciting. Not least
Mm.
because we've had lots of people who've got in touch who would love to come to the event, but they can't get to London, which is the location that we will be doing them from, at least for the time being.
Yeah, so we've had a few ideas about that. Um, one is to continue doing something we started a while ago, which is to do in-house presentations where firms would like us to do that, and those have been very successful.
Hmm.
And another is to continue the discussions with our partners at LexisNexis Risk Solutions to try and put on events a bit further afield. Um, but another string to our bow would be to use YouTube to blend our voices with a set of visuals to present some of the more complex case studies and stories of the day.
Yeah, and I know at some point in the next week or two you're going to be starting work on that. But I also know that you have actually created the brand on YouTube, and because I have done so, it is already possible to subscribe to that channel, so you get notice when we start putting that content online.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, have at it then, people.
Yeah,
The Dark Money Files channel on YouTube is apparently open for business, and there's no content on it yet, but there will be in the coming weeks.
brilliant. And I'm really looking forward to that. I think it will
Mm.
be, as you say, the podcast is always going to be our primary source because it was
Hmm.
the thing that launched us in the first place. But augmenting it with some of the other methods of getting in touch with people, I think, is just really quite exciting.
And we do hear, Graham, from a lot of people that the podcast at 15 to 20 minutes every week or every couple of weeks is a great way for them to keep up to date
Hmm.
professionally. And we wouldn't want to threaten that in any way. That will continue to be the case if you keep listening to the podcast. But we are going to offer a little bit more through the channel, which on an optional basis you might like to dip into. And we'll highlight on the podcast what's there from time to time, and those who are interested can go and have a look. But you absolutely don't need to get full value out of the podcast.
No, it's we offer people a choice.
Mm.
And I know we've had a chat. We've got some other, I think, quite exciting ideas in the pipeline, but we'll just
Shh.
keep our powder dry for the time being until they're a bit more
Absolutely.
worked up. But I think it is clear that there is a thirst out there for understanding better some of these global laundromats and professional money laundering and all the other things. So it's very much our mission in life is to try and bring this and make it accessible to as many people as possible.
Yep. As I pointed out, I think at the live event, what we don't need to be is Batman's going around individually doing our own solo bit. This money laundering requires a more Avengers like approach.
I think so, and we are assembled. So that's
Hey.
okay. Going back to the podcast, should we
Mm-hmm.
tell the audience, do you think, Ray, what the single most popular episode we broadcast over the last 9 months was, at least in terms of
Mm.
average listens per day?
Well, I'd quite like to know myself, actually, Graham.
Well, Ray, it was the episode we did not so long ago about the Deutsche Bank mirror trades. That was season
Oh,
2, episode 10, and it was by quite some margin.
and what does that tell us, do you think?
Well, I think it probably tells us that people knew all about the headlines of the story, but were pretty keen to understand better some of the complexities that, a lot of the press simply doesn't have the space to explain.
Well, hopefully we've been of assistance there.
Well, I'd like to think so.
Now, I also know that season 1, episode 3, where we looked in detail at the transactional data that we had on some of the Danske Bank entities, has been widely listened to and appreciated by banks around the world as a useful training tool for transaction monitoring teams.
Yeah, which once again is really nice to know.
Indeed. So keep sending in the feedback. It does make a difference to know the real world impact of what we're doing.
It does. And looking forward, we've got a second outing for the first Dark Money Files live event because there were not enough places in our first outing for everybody. So we're doing a second run of that first event on the 3rd of October at an even bigger location, soon to be announced, somewhere in London.
And on the heels of that, also soon to be announced, we have a second Dark Money Files live event. This time picking up on the success of that transaction data episode and turning that into a more visual explanation of just how much of that money was laundered through Danske Bank and how the thing worked.
Yes, then that should be really good fun.
And quite educational.
Which is a win-win, isn't it?
So I'm going to be busy on a number of projects, including the launch of our YouTube channel. What's coming up in your world over the next few weeks, Graham?
Well, Ray, it's really quite remarkably busy. I've got meetings with several UK advocacy groups over the next week or two, and then I'm off to do some presentations. I'm doing one in Copenhagen, one back here in London, one in Berlin, and hopefully I will be in Paris for the FATF plenary, which is in the 3rd week of October, giving my views on such things as beneficial ownership, mutual evaluation reports, and effective supervision of professional enablers.
It sounds like we might get some of that in a future episode or two of the podcast.
Well, all being well, yes. But Ray, I was having a think. In the meantime, with, as you said just now, your impending departure from your role in the direct firing line, I was thinking, maybe we should do an episode which allows you to summarise as far as you can, without breaching, obviously, any confidentiality requirements, some of the highs and lows, successes and challenges that face an MLRO in this modern world.
I'm absolutely up for that, Graham. We will have to keep it generic because, as you say, I'm not going to be breaking any confidentiality I owe our client.
No, and Ray, I wouldn't expect you to. It's something we're really careful. Anyone listening will have heard our rider clauses all the time. So, but I think because you have a fantastic way of explaining things. Your task for the next week is to get writing.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dark Money Files. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.